Okay. Hi there. Hi everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you for trusting me with 45 minutes of your life today. I'm Aitor Garcia and I'm the CTO of Depengo. We are a company specialized in instant payments, especially in the context of B2B and B2C. And I will try today to convey a sense of the landscape of instant payments globally, and then give you like a good view of what happens here in Europe, specifically what the schemes are actually in life right now, and how you can actually just profit on them and just instrument instant payment. So the first question is actually, what is an instant payment? Because the landscape globally is so heterogeneous and so different that even just coming with a definition is kind of hard. And the conditions that just in the previous sessions we saw about Brazil, they are not exactly the same in Europe. They are different in China. They are different in India. And they have different constraints and mandatory regulations in each one of them. So the bare minimum of what is an instant payment, I have tried just to put it there. And it's interbank first, so there is no transfers inside the same bank. It's always between different banks or institution or PSPs in the terminology that we use in Europe. They are irrevocably sent, so there is no going back. Once they're done, they're done. They are between bank accounts, so no credit cards involved, no payment cards involved, always bank accounts. And they're usually available to the beneficiary in 1 minute or less. So that is the very minimum, and you will struggle just to find an instant payment scheme around the world that is not actually just coming with this kind of minimum standards. But that is just what most of the schemes have. Over this kind of characteristics, you will find a second layer of instant payments that improve on them. And in which way? But basically, they gave universal access, so you can actually transfer to any bank in the system or most of the banks in the system. They will use like a ISO standard. They were talking about the standard for payment cards in the previous season. The one that is used mostly for most of the schemes in credit transfer is actually that one, 20022. We'll see about it later. And then finally, 24/7. 24/7 is one that is almost in all of the schemes, but not in all of them. Like there's some countries in markets that actually cut off in the weekends and things like that. So this is an improved version of the basics. And then we have the best version that is just, again, on top of that, like a layer 3 of instant payments. And there you will have like APIs and QR codes, like tools for accessibility, so people can actually just instrument the transfers more easily. Then you will have another very popular thing that is alternative identifiers like aliases and proxies. That is basically for the people that is living here in Spain, that is Bizum. Bizum, you can actually just link like a bank account to a phone number. That is a very usual proxy in many countries, Swiss and Sweden and many others. Sometimes you have national IDs. In Iceland, you can actually pay through the Kenitala, that is the national ID number. So you basically just cross-reference the ID with the bank account. And finally, the ability to push and pull payments. Like we usually focus very much on just pushing payments to different places, but not so much in pull payments. And there is a whole scheme that is just coming this year for request to pay in Europe. That is basically how we actually do a pull payment where we are requesting someone to pay us. So that will be like the top of the top. Like if we think about an instant payment system that can actually just work in a modern way, you'll find these characteristics very probably. So now that we hopefully know what we are talking about, what kind of characteristics instant payment has, we should talk about why. And usually the answer to that question is usually, well, the speed. You know, it's faster. Like, you know, who wants to get the money faster? That is a very usual argument, and it's true. Like, you know, most people will actually profit from getting their salaries faster instead of waiting for like a few days to get it. So that is an important one, but there's at least 3 other characteristics I have put there that I think are just equally important. The first one is isolation and precision, like the way you know exactly this transfer, if it just go through or not. Not like in a batch, not like a group of different transfers, but this specifically one. The second is transparency. So how does all the parts involved in the transaction, what is happening with the money? So I'm the one sending, what kind of information can I have? I'm the beneficiary, what kind of information I'm getting, and when I'm getting that information. And that is another thing that improves with instant payments. And finally, the certainty, like the way we know exactly and without any kind of doubt that the transfer has been done or has been rejected. And you can very legitimately think like, well, that is supposed to be happening right now with regular payments. Well, it's not. And the reason it's not is because the way that classic credit transfers work is that they're usually just grouped in batches. So they're just not atomic. They're just basically just getting a list of all the credit transfers that has been created from one time to another, creating a batch with that, and then processing, clearing, and settlement of the batch, like usually at the end of the day. And that produced like a lot of problems, basically because, you know, you don't have atomic information anymore. So what is the proposal of instant payments in that regard? So basically, the proposal is that the clearing and the settlement is going to be on a transaction case by case. So we are just going to have exactly the response for this transaction independently of any other that is going through the system or through the clearinghouse or through the settlement of any of the PSPs involved. The second one is that they are just executed as soon as they're received by the PSP. That is mandatory. That is basically one of the things that you have to do if you want to participate in the SEPA scheme. And then finally, another of the constraints that the scheme imposes on you is that they have to be executed in real time. And you will have like a hard limit of 10 seconds. So it's not something that you can actually postpone or delay. You are just constrained by law and by the participation on the scheme that you have to execute it in that time. So you probably can't see, but I will just try to describe what is happening there. I just try to create like a journey of a customer in an instant payment landscape compared to what happened, you know, usually. Sorry. So 4:15 p.m. Someone actually just goes to an online store and just buys a book. That's a very usual e-commerce transaction. Just that moment, the payment for the book is just going directly to the online retailer. And he's getting the amount of the book instantly in that moment. So it's 4:16 at that moment, probably earlier than that. Just a minute later, the online retailer can very easily just create like a cash engine system that detects when he's just getting a payment and then saying, okay, so I sold one book of this publisher, the price is 20 euros, the fee of the publisher is 2 euros, and just sending that to the publisher immediately. So another minute later, 4:18 p.m., the publisher of the book that was originally sold like 2 minutes ago, they already have the money. And because they actually have contractual regulations with the authors of the books, they will say, okay, so we got our fee, and the author is just getting 25% of that. So we are just going to send this cent to the author. That can actually be executed again like an instant payment. So just 1 minute later at 19 p.m., the author is getting the fee that is a part of what the publisher got by the initial sold of one book, 3-4 minutes before that. At the end of the flow, you have the author that has the money. It can very easily just use any kind of PSP app to send the money to his family or to any other destination. And then you get basically liquidity in the ATM or wherever you get your money in just 4 minutes from the beginning of the transaction in the web. So if you think about what is the actual landscape for this kind of transaction, we're just talking usually weeks. And that just is moving to a landscape where we are just executing this in 4 or 5 minutes. And all the technology, of course, that is supporting this is perfectly just something that you can create today. So what are the benefits for all this kind of stuff then? Well, better communication, that's very important, especially, you know, suppliers and supply chain in general, just knowing exactly what is happening when you're just paying for an invoice or just creating any kind of commercial transaction. Improve liquidity management, because one of the questions that people usually ask when they are just confronted with, you can just pay faster. They will say like, well, why I will actually like just to pay faster to my providers? I want it. Well, the thing is that you don't have to pay faster. Actually, it just means the opposite. You can actually wait till the very last moment to pay them. You have probably just contractual obligations with your providers. You can actually just wait to the very last moment, knowing that you will be able just to do the transfer in that last moment. And then keeping the liquidity to your own company just to do whatever you need to do with them. Real-time view of cash position, again, is just everything about transparency, more efficiency, better transaction data about each one of the transactions, because they're atomic and you will know perfectly what happens with each one of them. So there are just multiple benefits to, especially to corporate customers. Two big markets for that. The first one, gig economy. Devengo was actually created like a provider of salary advance. So our business initially was to actually get the money that the workers are actually earning from their companies and give it to them faster. Like, you will just be on the middle of the month, I have my car broke, and I can actually access my salary that I have earned during the month. So we'll actually just take that money and transfer it to you. With that business model, we have actually done like 500,000 salary advances in the last 3 years, and we actually moved like a few tens of millions of euros. So it's a big market, of course, and then in general, any kind of silo of administrative complexity. Like you will just find like big utility companies and phone companies that have to basically create hundreds of thousands of payments every month. And they just go through this kind of very archaic and very old way to process them and to deal with all the ramifications and implications of not having access to the real thing that happened with the payment. So those are just very big markets for any kind of solution in instant payments. So how long has this been happening? Like, you know, that is another question. Like, are we early to the game or we're just too late? And the thing is that it's very funny, but for almost like 50 years, we didn't see any kind of innovation on that. Like, we have the Japanese that are always like usually in a parallel dimension. They started like a service in the 70s. Then Switzerland, of course, they know all the stuff about banking. They started like a project like in the 80s too. But there were just a few of actually services that were just working in an instant fashion, like till 2010. Probably the most successful one is Faster Payments in UK. They launched in 2008, and they're just processing like a lot of payments from the very beginning. But then something happened in 2010, and then we have this Cambrian explosion of just schemes and possibilities and payments and networks and possibilities to send to customers and businesses and corporates instant payments. I have put here like a few, but there are just right now, the last count was 60 across the world. That is Europe, the Americas, Asia Pacific, basically the whole world. So this is only a small list, but this is just like a very difficult to actually track each one of them because we're just getting news every year. Russia just launched theirs like this year. Peru is going to launch too. Canada launched this year too. We're just getting more schemes and more different solutions all the time. What about numbers? Well, we have really massive numbers in the players that have bet on these kind of payments. India, China, UK, probably the three markets are just out of the league and in another complete level. They're generating this kind of incredible numbers. That is 70 million transactions, not per month, not per week. That is 70 million transactions per day. There are just people just getting paid 70 million times, in China every single day. And it is quite impressive just knowing that and reflecting on the fact that none of that just existed 10 years ago. All these schemes are just 10 years old. Well, Faster Payments is 12, but it's just really, really just early in the game. Another few examples, the US, they are just kind of late to the race, but they're just improving very fast. They have like a scheme now, RTP. They're supposed to reach almost half of the demand deposit accounts. That is basically checking accounts in the States. So not bad. They just launched like a few years ago, 5 years ago. So they're just growing fast, and they're just planning just to put the services and the opportunities so any bank in the United States can actually participate. And then you have Sele, that is a P2P solution that is more oriented to basically small payments between customers and between people. But that is just have like some incredible crazy numbers too, like 3 million transactions per day, hundreds of millions of dollars in value per day. Another scheme, P27, the Nordics, this is going to be launched this year too. So it's going to be a first because this is not only real time, this is not only cross-border, this is actually real-time cross-border and multi-currency. So it's kind of a first globally. Initial participants are going to be Sweden, Denmark, and Finland. Iceland and Norway. Norway was initially in the conversations to get in the project. They just get out for some reason, but they're still just considering if they want to join this program, and Iceland too. That is a very small market, but still. So actually the name of the project, P27, is because there's basically 27 million people in the Nordics, if you just take all the Nordic countries. So the idea behind this is that because they are just closely related, that they have like a lot of trade between the nations, they're just going to create something to remove friction. So they will actually be able just to pay very easily from Copenhagen to Oslo and back, or Stockholm or whatever. So that is the landscape, globally. What is happening here in Europe? Well, what has been happening here in Europe is that we are kind of a special creature in the banking system because we have this kind of thing that we call the Eurozone. So different countries, so cross-border, but same currency. And most of the same regulations, most of the same schemes. So it is very important for any of the banks or just any of the PSPs just working in Europe, just to have a solution, just to send money across the Eurozone in a kind of pan-European way. So right now, we have basically two different options. RT1, that is basically created by a group of banks and was the first one that launched, working very well. And then TIPS, that was just created by the central bank slightly later. That is another option. Basically, both networks do the same, but it's not mandatory for the banks to actually connect to the networks. So you will potentially have some banks that are in one network and not in the other. And your PSP has to be able just to connect to both or just the one that you are interested in. So landscape again, 60% of the PSPs in Europe has joined the scheme. Again, sorry for the interruption. So PSPs, 60% of the PSPs in Europe actually have joined the scheme. Again, the scheme, there's no mandate from the central bank to join the scheme, so each PSP can actually choose if they want to join or not. But so far, a good bunch of them have jumped in the wagon, and that does not actually represent that only 60% of the bank accounts of Europe are actually reachable, because some of the banks are just massive. So whenever the Santander or BBVA or each one of the banks that are just really big chooses to actually join the scheme, that brings like millions of accounts at the same time. So some numbers from Europe. 12% of the SEPA payments are actually just instant in the first quarter of this year. So that means that basically 1 of 10 transactions are actually just processing in an instant way. It doesn't look like much, but you have to look at the curve and just know that 2 years ago, the percentage was basically 1. So we're just increasing the speed of adoption in the Eurozone very, very quickly. Volumes, just 1,000 million euros per day. That is not a big, massive number like in China or India, but still very interesting. That was just only 200 millions 2 years ago. Spain, actually, what is the state in Spain? Well, most of the banks, like almost all of them, are just connected to RT1 or TIPS. So if you want to send like an instant payment in Spain, basically every single time you will have the option just to send it instantly. Half of the trade transfers has been instant this year in the data that has been just provided by Iberpay, that is the automatic clearing house here in Spain. So again, increasing numbers. Daily volume, just 500,000 per day. Bizum, that is actually just kind of the same instant payment, but using aliases and proxies, as I mentioned before, another 500,000. So big numbers, considering that we are just starting. So what are actually the conditions and the limits of these system payments in Europe? Well, always denominated in euros, because that is what SEPA mandates, and SEPA Instant is basically just a subclass of the general SEPA payments, so always in euros. 10 seconds execution limit, that is mandatory. That means that if you go over 10 seconds, the transaction will actually fail. So no second option. 100,000 euros max per transaction. So initially was 15,000. It was increased to 100 like last year. This is basically trying just to bring more corporate cases to the scheme. So, companies are usually just paying larger amounts. So that was a good improvement. 24/7 and using the standard 2002-22. So something important is that these are actually the minimums every single PSP has to actually comply with. But if you want, you can unilaterally, bilaterally, or multilaterally agree on just lowering the other standards. So, for example, in Netherlands, they have agreed to set like a maximum limit of 5 seconds instead of 10. Netherlands has been just basically moving all the money, like 90% of the money, instantly for a few years already. And they have no limit on the amount of money that they can transact. So this is the minimum if you want to play in Europe. About the standard, like has been mentioned in previous sessions, different standards. This is the one that most, not only Europe, but most of the instant payment schemes have choose and the wall. It's based on XML, as you can see, and is basically the foundation that is allowing the PSPs and the participants on the scheme to actually communicate. It's a very good thing that globally most of the countries have chosen this standard, because it opens the possibility in the future to be, you know, doing cross-border payments in a very standard way. And, you know, Canada has chosen this, RTP2, Europe, India, a lot of countries. So you will just find, it is, obviously the spec is massive, like 400 pages, but if you just cut to the chase, there's basically 3 areas in the XML, and you will just find like a group header that is basically like a metadata for the payment. Like this is going to be a payment of, you know, 100,000 euros, and it's going to be created at this time, blah, blah, blah. Then payment information, that is basically information about the originator of the instruction. And then finally, the transaction information itself. And then you say, like, you know, this is the description that I want to present on the movement. This is the amount. This is the beneficiary. This is his account, etc. And all the scheme is just based in this kind of 4-corner model. Some acronyms, so I will try to explain. CSM, that is clearing and settlement mechanism. It's basically like an automated clearinghouse. Is the institution that actually determines that the payment has been done by both parts. Then PSPs, that is payment service provider, there's going to be one in the side of the originator, one in the side of the beneficiary. And then finally, the 2 persons or companies that are just initiating or receiving the transaction. So how is everything instrumented? So there is a first step where you will just get the originator, like a customer, like a company, that basically says, I want to do this payment. That instruction is just going to the PSP, and the PSP will just do a few checks, like you want to move 20 euros, sorry, you only have 10, then the transaction is stopped. You want to move 20 euros, you are like in a public list of criminals, you can't. AML, money laundering prevention, regulatory systems, etc. Everything is executed at that point. It is interesting because as we just get the payments faster and faster, there is less time to actually just go through through all the anti-fraud prevention systems. So there's going to be like a lot of innovation in that space too. At the end, if everything is correct, the PSP is going to say, okay, so you want to move 20 euros. I'm going to make a reserve of 20 euros from now, before I just go down the chain of payment. And then, very critically, they just put a timestamp, because, you know, the moment you put a timestamp and just move that instruction from the originator to the PSP, the clock starts ticking, and you only have the seconds to actually respond to that. Second step, the PSP has the instruction, and he actually sent the message to the PSP. When you just hear PSP, you can think banks, fintechs, financial institutions in general. Bank is a good example usually because many of them are just banks. So the bank of the originator will actually have the instruction. They know that the originator wants to move 20 euros, and they basically give the authorization to the CSM, that is basically the clearinghouse, to reserve the funds. So they basically say, okay, I'm just going to move 20 euros. Be sure that you have 20 euros. Because if this goes through, you have to pay that 20 euros. And we don't want to be any kind of liquidity problem in the middle. And then that is the foundation for the certainty part of the scheme. Once you just get to that point, to the CSM, there is certainty that you have 20 euros, reserved for doing this transaction. So there is not going to be any kind of liquidity problem. Step 3, we're just going closer and closer to the beneficiary. The clearinghouse is actually sending the transaction to the beneficiary. So if I'm just sending from Santander to N26, that will be N26, and then they will check like, okay, so you are just sending 20 euros to this account. Oh, sorry, the guy or the girl just passed away yesterday, so the account is closed. Or, usually the happy path, everything is okay, so we want those 20 euros. When that is done, we just move to the next step. And we have the beneficiary PSP or bank actually sending back to the CSM like an acknowledgement, like, okay, we can do it. And from that very moment, you have confirmation from me that you can just go ahead with that transaction. So that will be the happy path. There will be obviously the possibility of negative confirmation. In that moment, when you have positive confirmation, the funds are available to the final users. And that has to actually just be executed in less than 10 seconds. So in that moment, there is usually like, in our experience, 4 or 5 seconds, the money is on the destinatory or the beneficiary account. Then we just move back to the CSM because we need still confirmation on the origin, and the CSM is going to say, okay, we finally just put the money on the beneficiary account. You can go ahead, you can actually check that the transaction was okay and everything was peachy. And finally, if there is any kind of problem, the CSM will actually send the PSP like a negative confirmation to say, like, something bad happened. The transaction was not able just to be produced and executed. Basically lift the reservation of the money because we can actually just provide the money to the final user. So that is the usual flow. And then like a small pitch, this is the commercial part. We just try to hide all that complexity behind an API, and to design it, we basically took the principles of the instant payments, how they're just executed well around the world, and just create the architecture for our technology around that. So we have scalability, to prevent problems with synchronous connection with the different banks. Like, you have to think that the PSP at the other end, they have like a 10-second limits, but that can be like 0.5 or 10 seconds. So there is like a massive degree of different performance in many of the PSPs and the banks. So you have to take account of that. And the way we did it was to actually just process them parallelly and in an asynchronous fashion. Transparency, we just send real-time webhooks to the customers all the time. We give them like specifiers according to the scheme. We're just going to open now in UK with faster payments. They will just have different errors, so our customers will be able just to get as detailed and atomic information as possible. We give them estimated times of arrival. Security, again, very important. The API has to be idempotent. You don't want people sending 20 euros twice because you just messed up with your queues or your workers. Has to be audited, of course, rate limitings, AML monitoring, all this stuff that is just becoming more and more complex all the time. And finally, it has to be atomic. Like, each transaction has to not only be isolated in the execution, but it has to actually encapsulate all the information, because it's not going to be connected to anything else. All the life cycle of the payment going to be unique in all parts, both in the originator PSP and in the beneficiary PSP. And I will just do now like a small, I don't know, is this working too? Now it's working, yes. So just a small demo. So we basically provide like an API that can have some authentication, of course, and then once you get your token, I don't know if it is, you probably can't see anything. So basically, you just get authentication. We just return a token, like usual web tokens stuff. We are able just to create accounts dynamically. So we could actually just cover 2 cases where, for a specific worker or a specific scenario, you want to create an IBAN on demand, and then just get it like a few seconds later. And then, of course, just creating a payment. So just going to create one now. I will just transfer myself a few cents, and then yes, stop, and execute that, and then we'll just get now everything that I was just talking about is happening on the background. We're just our PSP just talking to and we just get the transfer there. We were just talking to my Face ID. We were just talking to the PSP of N26, and then just getting the information. You can see, getting the information for the transaction and solving all this kind of confirmation and acknowledgement between the different PSPs on behalf of our users. And that is all I have for you today. And thank you. And I'm just. I will be happy just to take any questions that you have. Yes. You probably need this, right?
How often do you see banks charging for SEPA Instant versus SEPA credit transfer?
Well, in our scheme, well, the landscape right now is just for the final customer is incredibly expensive. Like most banks, but they are just charging just, I don't know, incredibly amounts. Like for a 100 euros transfer, you can just get charged like 10 euros easily, like a fee. So that is usually for the final customers. For the PSPs, it's different. Like we basically have like a super low fee for that, and actually like the final cost of the TIPS network, for example, that is 0.2 cents. So that is not 20 cents or 2 cents, that is 0.2 cents. That's the final cost for the network for TIPS in this case. Ours is slightly higher than that, but it's still on the cents. And that is like a flat fee independently of the price. I don't know if I answered your question. Well, because right now it's a premium, I think it's a premium product yet, so it is growing super fast, but it's not like mainstream yet. Those prices are just going to get lower and lower all the time. It's just a thing of time, I think, especially in the consumer space. Anyone else? Yeah.
I saw that you're providing Spanish IBANs, right? Do you operate also outside of Spain or only here?
So we operate right now in all the Eurozone. So basically you can just send any amount till 100,000 euros to any country in Europe. And that is going to be able just to be happening today. We're just going to open very soon in UK. So that will open the market for British pounds too. And we will just all the time just thinking about how to acquire more markets. So the idea finally, I think for most of the players in this space, is that they will have like a network of networks, and they will be able just to connect multiple different markets and multiple different countries under like an umbrella, an API umbrella, that will be able just to transfer all the stuff. There is still like a few projects that are just trying to do exactly that, like cross-border payments, but there is still just very early in the game for that.
Hey, this is more of a point, less of a question, but you highlighted very clearly that ISO 2022 is an XML definition. Swift have a JSON schema, but they've not published it. So anyone here that's involved at all with Swift or knows them, please lobby them and tell them to publish their JSON schemas, because you're right, no one's building anything using XML anymore, and if we want the interop, then we want JSON.
Yeah, that's a very good point. There's a lot of technology in banking that are just fighting with legacy all the time, and this is one of the examples. So the companies on the markets are just changing so fast, and the standards are usually much slower.